and welcome to another Looney Tunes review video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe to follow my journey to review all 1000 Looney Tunes shorts, and give this video a like as well. So this is a review for Clean Pastures, released in 1937. It's the 164th in the series, and it's directed by Friz Freleng. It is the third in the infamous Censored 11 series. As such, there is no official release for this short. This print I'm using, the person who scanned it is aware I'm using it for this review, but has chosen to remain anonymous. So in case you haven't seen this one, and I completely understand of course, being in the Censored 11, but essentially you have an angel who is dismayed at the fact that there are less people going into heaven, known as paradise here. He sends a dim-witted angel to try to recruit people to heaven. That does not succeed, so a bunch of musicians convince this angel that, hey, we can do it a much better way, and with all the wonderful music at the end, well, people are choosing now to go to heaven. It's a very strange one. So for this review, there'll be first a re-edit of my original audio commentary before I had to take it down due to a request by Warner Brothers Legal. Then will be my good friend Manny Cruz, the Toonie tenor himself, to discuss the music and all the references within, plus there'll be some final thoughts from me. So grab some popcorn and enjoy the review. Oh, by the way, I do like this background, so it's a really good background there. This one at least has some great music. The person playing the horn there is a character of Stephen Fetchit, who had a cameo in Porky's Road Race, but you may know him in another Censored 11 cartoon, All This and Rabbit Stew, and it's based off a black actor who would completely exaggerate his mannerisms like that as like a lazy African American, and so this is like an exaggeration of an exaggeration, really, and yeah, it's not really, acceptable or quite funny, to be quite frank. This one takes place in an urban setting where, there were obviously communities of people of color, particularly in Harlem, and a lot of it's also associated with jazz, and a lot of people may not know, but if you look at what rap music used to be perceived as, like gangster music, that if you like rap, you're obviously a criminal. That was the mindset. It was the exact same thing for jazz. Now here we've got some caricatures. So we've got Fats Waller, we've got Cab Galloway, Louis Armstrong, and I believe that's also Jimmy Lunsford. So yeah, essentially they convinced Black St. Peter that they got to do jazz music and they'll get more black people into black heaven, and that's pretty much what it is. So at least we're going to get some very good music. What's interesting about this cartoon as well, that was pointed out to me from an interview done by Michael Barriott, who animated Phil Monroe, who you may know has worked in the Chuck Jones unit. Phil Monroe basically said that the first cartoon he got credited for was this one, and he had to fight pretty hard to get a credit because of all the work he was doing at the time. And when he finally got a credit, he got credited on a cartoon that was barely even shown because the Hayes office at the time, who were regulating the morality of the movies and all that stuff, they declared it as sacrilegious, and yeah, it was just played in certain areas, so it didn't do him a lot of good having that credit on this particular cartoon at the time. You can imagine the sort of people who would have been in the Hayes office at the time. The straight, white, so-called wholesome white families. They didn't see themselves as equal with those of color, and yeah, they just didn't want anything to do with stuff like this. Which, yeah, that's just unfortunately how it was, and it's definitely not a good thing. So those are my original thoughts, and when my good friend Manny Cruz, the Toonie tenor, sent me his recording for this, he basically covered everything I was going to cover as the additional parts after the commentary. So rather than double up, here's my good friend Manny Cruz. So take it away, Manny.
Hi everyone, this is Manny Cruz, the Toonie tenor, coming at you to talk about a little music history and trivia. The 1937 Merry Melody cartoon Clean Pastures, directed by Friz Freleng. I haven't seen this cartoon in a while, and every time I come back to it, I have lots of mixed feelings. Mainly because musically, this cartoon, I think, has a lot of wonderful spots when it comes to the infusion of jazz music, the infusion of gospel music, and just the arrangements that Carl Stalling provided. But yeah, just every time I watch the visuals, just it really detracts away from the experience itself. So I actually, a few years ago, I isolated some of the tracks to this cartoon. For example, the opening, after the Merry Melody theme plays, you hear a little snippet of Save Me Sister, and that plays in the opening title screen, and then it fades into Sweet Georgia Brown. And that section there, I isolate it and I listen to it, as well as the main part of the cartoon, the Swing for Sale sequence that I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. I just love how musically they really, really catch my attention. But I did rewatch this one a little while ago, and I'm like, yeah, I forgot. Just how brutal this one is. Oh, sorry, gotta do my theme song. It's time for Manny's Music Time with music trivia for you today. Because I got swing for sale. Oof, a little rough. I think I sang a wrong note. I actually intentionally did that on purpose because whenever I sing Manny's Music Time, I sing it in the key of D flat major, also known as C sharp major. And Swing for Sale is in the same key. Da, 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 da. I don't have a piano in front of me, so I'm probably a little off. But yeah, Swing for Sale is in the key of D flat / C sharp major. And Manny's Music Time is, I do the same key. That's my favorite musical key, and anybody cared to know. So let's talk about the musical cues in itself. So obviously we start off with Merrily We Roll Along, and it goes right into Save Me Sister by Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg. If you listen to the commentary that I recorded for Sunday Go to Meeting Time, I go into depth about those two, the composer and the lyricist of that song, Save Me Sister. It goes into the very famous Sweet Georgia Brown, which was written by Ben Burney. If you're familiar with Ben Burney, he was a band leader in the 20s and 30s, and he was parodied in several cartoons. One of them I can think of in particular is the Cuckoo Nut Grove, as well as The Woods Are Full of Cuckoos. Yowza, yowza, that guy. Okay. Then it goes into Half of Me Wants to Be Good, which is featured extensively in the beginning of the cartoon when St. Peter is looking to see what's going on in Harlem. Goes into Swanee River, which is also known as Old Folks at Home, which was composed by the very famous or infamous American composer Stephen Foster. Swanee River is a minstrel song, and that's something that I once again go into detail. I believe that was a commentary I did for Hitting the Trail for Hallelujah Land, that I go into detail about the complicated legacy of Stephen Foster's music. The main part of the cartoon features Swing for Sale, and at the very end, you hear Oh Dem Golden Slippers. So there is a mix of gospel music, there's a mix of jazz, there's a mix of minstrel music, and it's an interesting cacophony of music to listen to. But again, once you start digging more into the history of especially the minstrelsy in the visuals as well as the musical elements, it kind of detracts away from the experience itself. I just want to isolate a few things musically, but before we go any further, I want to thank once again the amazing Keith Scott for his new book, Cartoon Voices of the Golden Age. I just want to point out a few of the contributors in the soundtrack. So for starters, Save Me Sister, Half of Me Wants to Be Good, and Odom Golden Slippers was performed by a group called Ben Carter's Plantation Choir. Later in the cartoon, you hear during the scene where the musicians Fats Waller, Jimmy Lunsford, Louis Armstrong, and Cab Calloway, when they're trying to convince St. Peter to change their strategy, the song Rhythm, Rhythm, Rhythm is performed by Paul Taylor Sportsman. Scott Whitaker is the man who does the impression of Cab Calloway, and my goodness, I just love his vocal performance in this cartoon. And the Basin Street Boys were responsible for performing the scene Rhythm is What This Country Needs, where the group starts imitating the Mills Brothers. So if you're not familiar with the Mills Brothers, they were a very popular black vocal group during that time period, and they were known for having very, very tight harmonies. Think of them as like a predecessor of doo-wop and things of those nature. And you'll notice in the cartoon as well that they are imitating a trumpet sound, and the Mills Brothers were famous for having that, as well as having a member who was a bass and the boom, 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 that really, really deep voice. Harlan Evans was the man responsible for doing the Fats Waller and Louis Armstrong impressions. I mean, I could go into so much detail about those particular artists themselves, but I have a lot of other things to talk about with this particular cartoon. So the cartoon itself has a lot of controversy. If you're familiar with the history of this cartoon, not only is it controversial now since the 1960s because of the whole aspect of it being part of the Censored 11, but it was even controversial during its time of release. I just want to read some excerpts from the book The Colored Cartoon, Black Representation in American Animated Short Films, 1907 to 1954 by Christopher Lehman. In the book, he goes into detail about the whole controversy about the cartoon being held up for distribution by objections from the Hays Code. In particular, they were having issues with the religious imagery of the cartoon. A huge part of it was the fact that they felt that religion was being mocked and burlesqued by having African Americans represent, St. Peter and the angels, and the fact that they're having jazz musicians, this scandalous jazz music, from Jimmy Lunsford and Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller and Cab Calloway trying to recruit people to come to heaven. This is from chapter 3 of the book. It's called Black Characterization. So he's talking about the use of jazz musicians in the cartoons that Harmon and Ising were doing over at MGM and other studios. And I quote, Freeling followed the lead of harmonizing in ignoring the intricate details of the celebrities caricatured in the cartoons. Clean Pastures offers no approximation of Cab Calloway's dancing, and studio musical director Carl Stalling did not try to compose a score that would implement the styles of the artists represented in the film, unquote. I'm mostly familiar with Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller. I don't know as much about Jimmy Lunsford, but from the music I'm familiar with those artists, I don't hear anything from them. I mean, the only thing close to it is that Harlan Evans was doing an impression of Louis Armstrong as well as Fats Waller, but nothing from their music in particular that stands out. And that's what Christopher Lehman mentioned in the book. And I continue reading and I quote, As in the years when harmonizing produced for Warner Brothers, Freeling's cartoon used none of the songs made famous by the celebrities, but rather employs tunes owned by the distributors, unquote. As we all know, Carl Stalling had free reign to use any song that was in the Warner Brothers library, and he picked from contemporary songs like Swing for Sale and Save Me Sister, as well as employing songs from the Black spiritual tradition as well as minstrelsy. And I continue reading from the book and I quote, Like harmonizing, Freeling did not exhibit much knowledge of or sensitivity to the entertainers he caricatured. The script for the film, as approved by him, crudely identifies Calloway's scatting as African American by twice calling his caricatures. I'm going to refrain from using this word because it's a racial slur. The word raccoon, take out the first three letters. So raccoon shouting. And I did not know that until I read this section today. But yeah, his amazing scat abilities. I mean, obviously someone was imitating Cap Calloway in the cartoon, but the fact that his amazing gift of scat and improvisation and just how dynamic of a musician that Cap Calloway was, his contributions, and this is based off the script, this is the transcription of the script that's in the Warner Brothers archives, reduces his musical contributions to racial slur shouting. It kind of reminds me, I've never seen the full picture of it, but another Censored 11 cartoon, All This in Rabbit Suit from 1941, that there is a model sheet of the hunter in that particular cartoon. The model sheet labels him as Texas, that particular racial slur. Raccoon, get rid of a few letters. It really is a shame that their contributions were just so reduced in that sense. And I mean, you look at Fritz Freeling himself. I mean, he's the most notorious member of the Censored 11 with Jungle Jitters in this and Sunday Go to Meeting Time and Goldilocks and the Jiving Bears. And then if you even think to cartoons that are not in the Censored 11 because they were in a different distribution package, but in particular, Anthony's very hated cartoon, Going to Heaven on a Mule. Oh, and before I continue, I want to remind you that not Going to Heaven on a Mule, because that came out in 1934. However, I believe, and don't quote me on this, that Going to Heaven on a Mule is inspired by the same source as Clean Pastures. So, Clean Pastures itself, the title of the cartoon, is an homage to the 1936 film The Green Pastures, which is a film that has biblical stories portrayed by black actors. For example, Rex Ingram plays D-Lode, and you have Eddie Rochester Anderson playing Noah and some other prominent African American actors at the time. It's one of only a few films from the Hollywood era of that time period that had a huge black cast, and it had all its troubles trying to get released. I was looking up the trailer for this film, and they had to employ Dick Powell to kind of like ease the audiences in that this film is going to have an all black cast. And again, it's just a shame that these actors and musicians didn't have the ability to show their gifts on their own without having to deal with the bigotry of that time period. Green Pastures, the original source of it was a 1928 novel, Old Man Adam and His Chillin' by Rourke Bradford, and which was later adapted into a Pulitzer Prize winning play in 1930, which was named The Green Pastures, just like the cartoon. And I'm pretty sure that Going to Heaven on a Mule was adapted from either the play or the novel. Another huge source of my research, I have to give a huge shout out and credit to the amazing musicologist Daniel Goldmark and his book Tunes for Tunes. So tunes like tune and music, for tunes, cartoons abbreviated. It's an excellent book if you really want to also learn the history of music and animation and Hollywood animation. I highly recommend you get it. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the book. It is from the section called Jazz and Popular Music, the Warner Brothers Cartoons. And I quote, Clean Pastures is a morality tale that takes us back to the heydays of the Harlem clubs, offering us an example of how cartoon musical shifts between the main story and a musical interlude or number. The main title begins in an unusual manner, which immediately establishes the cartoon's theme of redemption. An all male and clearly understood to be all black chorus sings the a cappella phrase, Save Me Sister from Temptation, over the opening credits. A song taken from yet another Warner Brothers musical film, Al Jolson's The Singing Kid, released a year before Clean Pastures. Its brief appearance foreshadows the cartoon's religious theme. The plot is simple. Heaven, Paradise, has a shortage of residents in contrast to Hell, Hades Incorporated, where the wanton inhabitants of Harlem head after a life of dancing, drinking, and carrying on, all to the tune Nagasaki. And I forgot to mention that in Q Sheet, so I apologize. The angel in charge sends his assistant, an angel who is a caricature of Stepin Fetchit, down to Harlem to lure the Hades-bound Paradise, but to no avail. During Fetchit's entreaty to the Harlemites, Bill Bojangles Robinson walks by and soft shoes old folks at home, also known as Swanee River, as he is followed by Al Jolson and Blackface, who sings a chorus of I Love to Singa, further confusing the hapless spirit. Several other musicians in Paradise, Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, Cap Calloway, and Jimmy Lunsford, they forgot to mention, persuade the head angel that rhythm will make the place more attractive. They descend to earth and launch into a swinging version of Swing for Sale. The song perfectly works as an enticement to come to paradise. Louis Armstrong's impassionate solo, during which his eyes bug out and his face turns purple, together with the vocal hand and mouth effects employed by the Mills Brothers, convinces the Harlem pleasure seekers to sing and dance their way to the promised land. Clean Pastures' climax, like that of its theatrical predecessors, invokes the spirit of a revivalist camp meeting, complete with the promises of salvation available to anyone who repents of his or her sinful ways. In its proposed route to salvation, Clean Pastures uses rhythm as a metaphor for religious faith, showing again how strongly the white population identifies jazz with aspects of black culture, including religion and the unfettered expressions of emotion associated with it. Rather than offering an alternative to the swinging Harlem music, and in case you're unfamiliar, this is for Anthony as well as for others, Harlem is in New York City, in the borough of Manhattan. It's in northern Manhattan, where it has a large black population, and a lot of famous music and artwork comes from Harlem, especially during that time in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I go back to reading the book. Rather than offer an alternative to the swinging Harlem music, the heavenly musicians appropriate the very hottest sounds for their own purpose, to lure people to paradise. The joy seekers embrace a lively version of James Bland's minstrel tune, Oh, Dem Golden Slippers, on their way skyward. As hot music is combined with a traditional spiritual, both the music loving Harlemites and the angels in heaven get what they want. Furthermore, placing the creators of good hot jazz in heaven suggests that certain types of black music are better than others. In quotations, hot music made in such places as Harlem would lead to debauchery and eventually to Hades Incorporated. Only through the noble efforts of famous black musicians could souls be turned to a better direction. Armstrong and Calloway must have been deemed safe enough, or at least sufficiently non-threatening to whites to represent angels. Their success as crossover musicians, popular among black and white consumers, no doubt helped establish them as harmless, as it would have been for the other artists we have already come across, like the Mills Brothers. Like the Hollywood musicals of the 1930s, of which so many of the Warner Brothers cartoons were made, Clean Pastures moves from the real world, the urban city, to a surreal realm. In this case, the all-star band, singing promises of a swing-filled eternity, eventually leads the righteous away from Harlem and into heaven beyond any bounds of earthly reality. Yes, there's a lot more that I could read from it, but I believe I've already read enough. But I will say there's another section, and I'm paraphrasing this. What's interesting is after this cartoon and some other MGM cartoons like Swing Social and things of that nature that incorporated jazz musicians into these cartoons as caricatures. I know that MGM had several cartoons where jazz musicians were represented as frogs. In, the Warner Brothers shorts, they had gross caricatures of these musicians. But by the time the 30s ended, these caricatures did not appear as much. It kind of faded away from the public consciousness. I mean, I shouldn't say public consciousness, but away from Hollywood studios. Now, was racial stereotyping still a thing with African Americans? Of course. There is so much more that I want to talk about in this particular cartoon because, again, I have such mixed feelings about it. The Basin Street Boys and Ben Carter's Plantation Choir and Harlan Evans and all these other amazing musicians that they had come in to do these songs, it really stinks that such talent was used for imagery that not only caused issues in 1937, and off the top of my head and from what I'm reading, I did not see any complaints about the cartoon that were contemporary to that time period. I know, for example, Coal Black and the Seven Dwarfs, the NAACP was complaining about it back then. People were complaining about Scrub Me Mama with a Boogie Beat from Universal, that it was actually withdrawn from distribution at the end of the 40s. And because it always makes me laugh when people say, "Oh, but those cartoons, they were fine back then, but now everybody has a problem with it." And I'm like, no, people objected to these images and these stereotypes back then, but unfortunately, their opportunities to voice their complaints, it's much easier to raise objections to material like that now as opposed to the 40s and 30s. And I can only imagine the precarious position that these musicians were in. So Ben Carter's Plantation Choir and the Basin Street Boys and other black artists who worked in Hollywood, that they had to take on these stereotypical roles or they didn't get paid, they didn't get gigs, and they couldn't feed their family and all that. Fortunately, that's not the case as much anymore. Sadly, there is still a lot of bigotry and sexism and ageism and all these other issues that appear in Hollywood. Again, I could just keep rambling on and on, but I'm looking at it. The recording time has already been pretty long. Yeah, this is definitely a tough one to watch because every time I come back, and I haven't seen Clean Pastures in a while, but every time I come back to it, I just fall in love with some of the musical aspects of it. But it's like this wonderful music is being taken away from the images. I know I'm repeating myself constantly. And what's interesting is that, the point that Christopher Lehman brought up in his book, that this cartoon is caricaturing, huge artists, Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong. But Carl Stalling, whether it's because he didn't feel like dealing with royalties or dealing with the owners of the music at the time, or just flat out ignorance, did not try to incorporate music that would sound reminiscent of these particular artists, having songs that would reflect Louis Armstrong's skills as a vocalist and a trumpet player, or Cap Calloway's amazing vocal skills, and so on and so forth. There's one other little minor musical thing that drives me nuts in this cartoon. So you have the scene where St. Peter calls his angel and say, "Hey, get to work and let's bring some people up to heaven." And you see the very, very, very crudely drawn caricature of Step Infection, which it's so exaggerated. It's like, I don't know how anybody thought that was a bright idea. But anyway, when a Step Infection angel is practicing his trumpet, I noticed that he has 4 valves in his trumpet, and most trumpets have 3 valves, and he's trying to play simple C scale. C, D, E, F, G, and he's playing C, D, E, F, and he keeps messing up on the note G. And what he's doing is that he's playing the first valve, then the second valve, then the third valve, then the fourth valve, and then he tries playing the first one again. And I'm like, I'm not a brass player, but I have taken some classes in how to play a brass instrument. And I'm pretty sure that if you're trying to move up in consecutive notes or whole steps from C to D, from D to E, off the top of my head, I believe C is open position, so you don't press any valves. D, it's the first and second valve. E, I believe it's valves 2 and 3. F is you don't play any valves. And G, I believe, is valves 1 and 2. And how a trumpet player changes their tone, besides pressing different valves in a combination, is also adjusting the speed of their air in their lips. They call that the embouchure. And, for a lower note, they don't play as fast and their lips are more tight, as opposed to when they play higher. I believe it's every 4 notes, they have to change the way that they're buzzing and producing the air to pretty much shift the gears. I can't think of another way of saying it, but shifting the gears of how to play a trombone or a trumpet or a tuba. I give trumpet and horn players a lot of credit because that thing is not easy to play. I played the saxophone growing up in high school and elementary school, middle school, and a little bit of college. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, you could play every note as long as you know what the fingerings are, you're fine. But with brass instruments, you're only limited to 3 valves, and you really need to make sure that your embouchure is in the exact correct position because you might want to scream out a high note, but if your lips are not quite there, you're going to be playing in the wrong range and it's going to throw everything off. Wow, this is a long one. Anthony's going to kill me, and I didn't intend on recording this long. I did paraphrase a lot of the book. But once again, I think what Daniel Goldmark said in the book, as well as Christopher Lehman, stated the musical elements of this cartoon way better than I could have. And there's so much more that I wanted to talk, but I sadly ran out of time. Maybe for another installment of Manny's Music Time, I'll elaborate more. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for listening to Manny's Music Time for Clean Pastures. This is definitely a tricky one because, like I said, musically, there's some brilliant stuff in here, but tons of baggage, tons of baggage. So thank you once again for listening. I hope you enjoy. And most importantly, I hope that you learned something new. Stay informed, be open minded, learn new things, treat everybody with love and respect, and be a better person. Enjoy music. Music's amazing. And so long, folks. Have a good night.
Thank you, Manny. In fact, he did such a great job here, I don't think I can add too much except to say that I'm in full agreement with him on this one. The music is nice, and the actors hired to approximate the voices do a great job, despite, as Manny pointed out, the songs aren't exactly the correct adaptations of what the musicians were actually doing. If you can ignore that part, at least it still sounds good. But ultimately, this one's a mess, due to the messaging within, which, again, I won't repeat since Manny went into detail on it already, and this video is long enough as it is. And there's really also no gags here to speak of, unless you count possibly the worst depiction of Stephen Fetchit in the Censored 11 shorts, which no reasonable person would find funny today. So this one gets a 3 out of 10 for me, 1 for the backgrounds, 1 for the animation despite some of the designs, and 1 for the music. So thanks guys for watching this video. I know it's a long one, but I hope you learned something. I certainly did. So yeah, thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.
Room for one more.